factor the greatest common factor, we need to know the number that goes into both of these numbers, the largest number. And the largest number is 9. In the variables, all we do is take the lowest exponent. So we have x squared and x cubed. X squared is the smallest. Then you put parentheses, because we're multiplying, and we divide. 9 into 18 is 2. X squared and x cubed is just an x. And 9 into 27 is a positive 3. X squared and x squared is 1, so we don't need to write it. So there is our factoring using the greatest common factor. Now over here, with two letters, we don't do it any differently. We find our greatest common factor between all three numbers, which in this case happens to also be a 9. And out of the variables, it's the lowest exponent, which happens to be an x and a y. So now we just divide. 9 into 27 is 3. X into x squared is x. Y into y cubed is y squared. Minus 9 goes into 9 negative 1 times. X goes in x. Goes into 1 time with the y. And then we get a positive 9 for our last factor. So it doesn't matter if we have more than one letter. We do the same process. Factoring out a negative is the best way to do this problem. So I have a negative in the front, so I'm going to use a negative. And my number that goes into all three of them is 3. Variables, you just look at the lowest exponent, so it's a squared, and it happens to be a b. And when I divide, negative 3 into negative 18 is 6a squared, b squared. Then when I do negative 3 into 6 is a minus 2. And we get a b. And then when we do the last one, we get a positive 5. A and the b cancels. So there is our answer to example 6. Now, example 7, we have this factor, which is what's common between the 2, and x plus 3 happens to be an expression that's common. So we have an x plus 3. So I'm going to take that part out. What's left over when I divide the x plus 3, I get an x squared. And when I take out an x plus 3 over here, I get a 5. And so my factors end up being what's left over and an expression. Let's do that again with this example here. What's common between the y plus 1, and 2, y plus 1? Y plus 1 is the common factor. And when I take that out, I'm left with an x and a minus 2. And there's my answer for that one. Factor by grouping, when there's no common factor, there's nothing common between any of these, we group them. I'm going to group my first 2 together, like this, and my next 2 together, like this, and then I factor just these 2. So I'm going to factor this. Greatest common factor happens to be x squared. And when I factor that out, I'm left with x plus 4. When I do the same thing over here, greatest common factor happens to be a 3. When I factor that out, I get x plus 4. What's in the parentheses now is the same method we just got done doing. It's common, so that becomes my factor. And then what's left over, x squared plus 3, is my other factor. And there's the answer using the grouping method. Now let's do this again. I have this expression, nothing is common, so I'm going to group the first 2, and then I'm going to group the second 2. What's common between these 2 is an x, so I'm left with y plus 5 when I factor out the x. And over here, because I have a negative, I'm going to factor that negative 4 out, which leaves me a y plus 5. Notice using the negative, as in the last example, gives me what's the same thing, which is now my first factor. And then what's left over is the x minus 4. And so my answer then is x plus 5 times x minus 4.